of this class series has been to discuss the main causes of the global rise of authoritarianism and fascism, and to offer ideas for creating a humanist opposition. And as we discussed earlier, fascism, based on Robert Paxton's definition, and Robert Paxton is a person that I've cited because he's the foremost scholar of fascism. Based on his definition, as we've discussed in previous classes, fascism is mainly characterized by three features: the mass embrace or mass rejection of reason and critical thinking, the mass embrace of social Darwinism or the ideology of survival of the fittest, and complicity on the part of a large chunk of the elites who bow to fascism, even if they're not fascists. Humanism, however, promotes the idea of coming together around universal ideals, ethical ideals, concepts, and it's about the idea of using our reasoning ability to solve problems. So humanism requires that we as humans see ourselves as parts of a whole, which includes all of humanity and nature. And as the Iranian poet from the 13th century, Sa'di is a famous Iranian poet from the 13th century, said, human beings are parts of a whole body and made of the same essence. If one part is in pain, the others shall not rest easy. This is a very, very famous poem from Sa'di. And when we were growing up in Iran as children, this was in our elementary school textbook. So that's why humanism is the antidote to social Darwinism and fascism, because it means that you have to see yourself as part of a whole of humanity and nature, and you have to have a global view. So with that introduction in mind, let's talk about the topic of today's class, which is opposing warmongering and practicing international solidarity. Features of the rise of authoritarianism and fascism in the 21st century has been a return to power grabs and the carving up of the world into spheres of influence. In the post-World War II world, US imperialism claimed to represent democracy, and the USSR, Soviet Union, also claimed to represent socialism. And of course, both superpowers, as we know, violated those principles and the rights of other countries and peoples. But at least they claim to represent those ideals. In the 21st century, the US, after its disastrous invasions and occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, after the 2008 economic crisis, has openly and not secretly made deals with authoritarian, religious fundamentalists and misogynist governments such as the Taliban to withdraw from Afghanistan. It has openly supported Israel's mass slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza or Gaza, while paying lip service to a promised two-state solution to be worked out by or to be administered by the authoritarian states of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Under the Biden administration, the US did give support to Ukraine's struggle for democracy against Russia's brutal invasion, the full-scale invasions that started 3 years ago in February of 2022. However, the US did not provide Ukraine with enough arms to win. It only gave Ukraine enough to keep fighting. Now, what we've seen in the first month of the second Trump administration is something qualitatively different. It starts, I would say, a far more terrifying epoch in world politics. So here are some features of this new, what I would consider a new epoch, um, or most definitely a major shift in foreign policy by the Trump administration. So first, the Trump administration has cut off aid to the US Agency for International Development that supports millions of people in the global south with indispensable health and education programs. It has declared economic tariff wars against friendly nations such as Canada, Mexico, and European countries. It has announced that the US wants to take over the Panama Canal, Greenland, and own Gaza. Trump has said that he wants the 2.3 million Palestinian population of Gaza to leave their homeland and settle in Jordan and Egypt so that the US can take over Gaza and turn it into a casino tourism business for the US. And on the third anniversary of Russia's brutal and genocidal invasion of Ukraine this month, the Trump administration ordered Ukraine to surrender to Russia, has forced Ukraine to sign an agreement based on which Ukraine has to give at least half of its the revenue from the sale of minerals and other resources to the US in exchange for the aid that the US has already given it in the past 3 years. And there was no condition like that when the Biden administration gave the aid to Ukraine. They didn't say you have to pay us back. But now Trump is saying, well, you have to give us half of the revenue from the sale of your minerals and other resources to pay us back for what we've already given you. They're not promising to give any more. They're not providing any security for Ukraine against Russia. They're just forcing Ukraine to surrender to Russian imperialism without any support, any security. It's really a horrendous situation for Ukraine. And on top of that, so it's not only that the US under the Trump administration is forcing Ukraine to surrender, it's that it is now engaging in extensive economic and political ties with Russia. There was a so-called Ukraine peace conference in Saudi Arabia last week without Ukraine. Ukraine wasn't there. So it was the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Russian Foreign Secretary Sergei Lavrov, with the Saudi Arabian government as the host. And they basically made a deal that the US and Russia are going to be allies. They're going to have extensive economic and political relations. The US is going to lift all sanctions on Russia. And Russia is an ally a strong ally of China, which of course we know has been vying for global superiority with the United States. Russia, as we know, is an authoritarian police state, and so is China. And Russia has expressed no intention of breaking its alliance with China. So, because some people have compared what Trump is doing to, for instance, Nixon's sending Kissinger to meet with China's leaders to establish ties with China. But in that case, China had become an enemy of Russia, so it was really an enemy of the US enemy. But in this case, Russia has no intention of breaking its alliance with China. So the Trump administration's policy changes are not only gross violations of human rights, they represent an existential danger to US capitalism and its imperialism. They will strengthen Russian and Chinese imperialism. They will open the door to further Russian invasions in Europe, as well as China's invasion of Taiwan, they will also push Europe and other friendly nations in the global south and around the world to turn to China for support. They will make the US population vulnerable to cyber attacks and other brutal terrorist attacks, if not outright invasions. So this policy shift is so incredible that we really need to take some more time to analyze it. So this is just a preliminary response. But regardless, but it is definitely a shift that will have catastrophic ramifications. And regardless of the immense support for Trump among Republican leaders and the 77 million people who voted for him, these foreign policy changes, along with the massive domestic budget cuts and the firings that we've all seen the past months, will surely create divisions among Trump's supporters. These changes are bound to do irreparable damage to the US infrastructure and daily operations, as well as its standing as a world power. So in the face of this maddening reality, what is needed is a principled opposition to imperialist invasions and capitalist exploitation of humanity and nature. We need a people-to-people solidarity with struggles for self-determination, human rights around the world, and a shared effort to develop a vision of a humanist alternative to capitalism. Such a form of international solidarity, I would argue, requires a deep understanding of the key struggles that are currently taking place in the world. So for the rest of my presentation, I would like to focus on two of these key struggles: Ukraine's struggle against Russian imperialism and the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, as well as the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. In an earlier presentation in January, I discussed key struggles in Iran, Syria. So I will, and I did include Ukraine there too. But I will not be discussing Iran and Syria here, because I think I said enough in that presentation, and that is available on my website if you'd like to go back to it. Okay, so international solidarity with Ukraine. So the Russian state fits all the characteristic features of fascism that Paxton has described: the mass rejection of reason and critical thinking, the mass embrace of social Darwinism, and the complicity of the elites. So I don't think I really need to say more about that. But I do want to single out some of the unique features of the Ukrainian struggle. So Ukraine has had a 300-year history of struggles against Russian colonialism and domination. Ukraine was basically colonized by the Russian Empire under Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, and for a brief period in the beginning of the USSR, it had more rights, but under Stalin, millions of Ukrainians were killed in a campaign of forced starvation, which is known as the Holodomor. And of course, it was the Chernobyl nuclear accident that many of you are probably familiar with. It happened in 1986. That happened. Putin is so determined to take Ukraine back because Russia, like Trump, Putin says that he wants to make Russia great again. And part of that effort is to take back the lands that were part of the Russian Empire. And Ukraine is a very important part of Russia's effort to regain its past grandeur. And so, and Ukraine has a lot of important resources. And so Putin is not willing to let Ukraine have its own independent state. Ukraine got its independence in 1991 and gave up its nuclear arms in order to keep its independence. But of course, it was attacked again in 2014. There were efforts to take over its government, and when that didn't work, Russia invaded in 2014. It was a partial invasion, took over part of eastern Ukraine, and then again, the full-scale invasion in 2022. Ukraine's people and the state itself, they do believe in the principles of human rights and women's rights. Prior to the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine met all the basic criteria of democracy, which is free elections, separation of powers, and free press. Now, Russia uses this propaganda effort to say the Ukrainians are fascist, Ukraine is run by fascists, which of course is disinformation. But to the extent that there are fascists or pro-Nazis in Ukraine, the Russian invasion has actually helped them, because every time there is an imperialist invasion, that of course intensifies nationalist and extremist sentiments. So the way to oppose even the degree of fascist sentiments that exist in Ukraine is to stop the Russian invasion, not to help it. And then Ukraine's people have appealed to the world to recognize that their struggle against Russia's genocidal invasion is not only about saving Ukraine, but about really fighting fascism. It has been about preventing the world from being carved up into fiefdoms by authoritarian and fascist regimes. And I want to quote this passage from Hanna Perekhoda, who's a Ukrainian feminist who was featured in the film, the documentary film that you saw as your assignment for this class. And she says, for Putin, the world is a zero-sum game between great powers who share the world pie. So let's stop, or rather Putin is saying, let's stop pretending and normalize the law of force instead of this hypocritical force of law. Because this is how the world has always been and will be. This is the vision that made him invade Ukraine, and this is the global project he is imposing through this seemingly local war. Kremlin wants to build a world where every self-proclaimed great power would have its own exclusive zone of influence, where it can exploit populations and nature in total impunity, without being bothered by any international norms and rules. And then she continues, what is important to understand for people outside Ukraine is that Ukrainians defending their right to exist are also objectively defending the project of a future where change is possible. A society where you can be a citizen with rights rather than a serf without any right. A state with free speech, freedom of association, free elections, independent courts, that is a fundamental framework for any political and social struggle. Taken wrongly for granted in many Western societies, these rights and freedoms have to be defended constantly, and Ukraine is one of the front lines of this struggle, an international and external front line, but the very same battle is also fought inside every country. So I wanted to quote that because I thought that was just such a powerful way of explaining what is happening to the world and why the Ukrainian struggle is so important and why it should matter to us. what happens to the Ukrainians should matter to us. So the truth is that even at this point, after 3 years of Russia's full-scale invasion, despite Russia's upper hand and the exhaustion of the Ukrainians, if the Ukrainians could receive the military aid that they need, and if Russia's economy were truly embargoed, Russia would lose. So Russia's manpower and resources are not endless. However, the Trump administration, by forcing Ukraine to surrender and also by removing US sanctions on Russia and embarking on this extensive set of economic and political relations with Russia, is really trying to save this fascist regime. That's really what's happening. That is what this forcing Ukraine to surrender is all about. So this is a critical moment when popular opposition to this policy can make a difference. And I think effective popular opposition really begins with local discussions among us in the US on the significance of Ukraine's struggle. Why should Ukraine matter to us? Why is it that Ukraine's survival isn't only about Ukraine, but it's about our survival too? And so I hope that in the discussion, I will hear from you about, what you thought of the film and how you think you can work with it. Okay, now let's move to the next topic, which is, or the next part, which is solidarity with Palestinian and Israeli peace activists. Or rather, solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, but in the context of solidarity with Palestinian and Israeli peace activists. So I don't need to tell anyone here about the brutality of Hamas's October 7 assault on Israel, October 7, 2023, and then the mass slaughter of Palestinians by Israel when it launched its latest invasion of Gaza or Gaza in the same month, October of 2023. Everyone has been watching that on TV and knows how horrendous it's been. And up to now, according to sources inside Gaza, the Gazan Health Ministry, at least 47,000 Palestinians have died because of Israel's invasion. And they're saying that it's much more. Some estimates are 100,000. And the war has now been extended to the West Bank and Lebanon, although there is a tenuous truce, but who knows if it will last. So I thought it would be more helpful for me to just give a sense of the different explanations of the origins of the conflict between Palestine and Israel, because that can help us figure out what kind of solidarity is needed. So in general, you can say that according to scholars and historians of Palestine and Israel, this conflict is explained in two different ways. There are those who say that Israel is a colonial and racist project of dispossession of Palestinians that was backed by Britain and other Western imperialist powers in the 20th century. And then there are those who say that this is a conflict between two nationalisms, one Palestinian and one Jewish, that could not reconcile with each other. And the latter view argues that Zionism was not a colonial and racist project, but an effort to confront European anti-Semitism by creating a homeland for Jews, and that it had different tendencies within it. It had a humanist socialist tendency, it had a fascist tendency. Both sides, however, argue that had it not been for the Holocaust, Zionism would not have become a mass movement, and millions of Jews would not have wanted to migrate to Palestine during and after World War II, but especially after World War II. So what can be a principled humanist position? I think it has three components. First, of course, we have to condemn and oppose the extremist government of Netanyahu and prior extremist and brutal governments of Israel, which have devised plans to promote ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, the complete takeover of their land, the violation of the UN resolutions, and of course, we have to oppose US military aid to Israel, because it's that military aid to Israel, it's, I think, several $1 billion a year that is really facilitating this mass slaughter of the Palestinians. So of course we have to condemn that. And then of course we have to condemn and oppose Hamas and Hezbollah, which are reactionary, misogynist, religious fundamentalist organizations that have, they've killed not only Jews, but they've repressed and killed many democratic voices within the Palestinian struggle. And they're backed by the reactionary and religious fundamentalists and authoritarian government of Iran, which is where I'm from. And they are a reactionary force within the. I think the most important part of a humanist, principled humanist solidarity is that to recognize that there are Palestinian and Israeli Jewish peace activists on the ground who believe that the only solution to this conflict is to recognize the rights of both peoples to the land, either in the form of a binational secular state for both to coexist as equal citizens, or in the form of a confederation of two independent states with open borders and the rights of Palestinians and Israeli Jews to live in either state as citizens or as residents and to travel in between the two states. So that seems to me the most important part of the humanist position on the issue of solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and solidarity with both peace activists, both Palestinian and Israeli Jews. Say that solidarity with Palestinian and Israeli peace activists can also not be separated from solidarity with other struggles for democracy and human rights in the Middle East. So Iran is one of those countries. Syria, another one that we discussed in January. So let's go to the conclusion, which is that once again, I want to go back to the beginning. The fact that the Trump administration's shifts in foreign policy mark a break with the post-World War II order, in the sense that the US is abandoning any talk of democracy and breaking its alliances with European democracies, Canada, and various nations in the global South in favor of an openly rapacious capitalist carving up of the world. The Trump administration's alliance with Russia, a global power which has been a longtime enemy of the US and is a strong ally of the other global superpower, China, I would argue poses an existential danger for the future of the US as an independent country. So this is a moment for humanist opposition to speak out against the rapaciousness and inhumanity of capitalism and imperialism. We need to oppose the US alliance with Russian imperialism and speak out in defense of Ukraine. We need to speak out in defense of the Palestinian struggle for self-determination and all democracy and human rights advocates in Ukraine, Russia, China, all of Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America. And this is not only for their sake, it's for the sake of our own existence as a people and a country. And I hope that in this 4-part series, I have been able to offer you some conceptual frameworks and approaches and promote international solidarity in ways that really delve into complexities and engage in people-to-people solidarity and dialogue. So I will stop now. I look forward to hearing from you.